right, awesome. So that actually wraps up the 15 minutes perfectly. And thank you again, John. That was absolutely wonderful. And with that, I think we can get started with our roundtable discussion on cell sorting. So I'd like to invite Rui and Robert to join us again for this discussion by video and audio, if you can. And for all of our attendees that are here today, I welcome you to utilize that Q&A section of Zoom to ask any questions that you have. And I'm going to open this up to everyone here. And I want to ask the first question, which is, what do you think are the most salient limitations of current cell sorting technology? And how do you think they could be addressed? So it's a really small question, nothing too crazy. But what do you think the biggest limitations are today?
Of cell sorting?
Yeah, and the instrumentation and the technology itself, and how do you think it could be addressed?
Right. So, I mean, I can start, right? If you're okay with it. One of the, biggest limitations. So let's put it this way. I think if I would ask this question to everyone, I think I would know the answer. If we could have several parallel sorters, right? And we actually do that, in facilities that you're actually fortunate to have more than one sorter. Sometimes we do that, right? You have two sorters, you can divide the time by half. As we mentioned, one of the critical things in getting a good, successful downstream application is being able to sort as fast as possible, right? And it's not only sorting, but preparing the samples as fast as possible, as quickly as possible, and then sorting as quickly as possible. So I think one of the biggest limitations that people see to this day, because like I mentioned, electrostatic sorters are limited by Poisson statistics. We would love to have sorters that would actually sort faster with maintaining the same purity, the same recovery, etc. So, let's imagine several parallel sorters where you could sort everything in a much faster way. This is something that what was the company Cytonome? Cytonome had this microfluidic cell sorter where it had, I forget now, 72 channels, the chip, where you actually, so the sort itself was relatively slow, right? Sorted, I don't remember, like 200 events per second or something like that. But then multiply that by 72 and you had a really, really, really fast sorter. Of course, if you think of 72 electrostatic cell sorters altogether, you will only find that in XY technologies or something like that. But other than that, you won't find that that same amount. But I would say that that's one of the limitations, because again, if the other limitation is the impact of cell sorting on cells, I'm actually not that convinced, as I mentioned in the talk, that it's having that much of an impact, at least on the majority of the cells that we are sorting, right? So I would say it would be speed, for instance. That's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, there are a couple of companies I see in the market who are addressing that, cellular highways out of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, another thing to think about too is the limitations when you go from like T cells, B cells, and you're going and using a 70 micron nozzle and going up to these large cancer cells where you have the difference in nozzle and then the difference in speed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So there's another question that actually went back to a little bit earlier, talking about the differences in cell size. So there are two questions that came through actually that I think Rui, we can address now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there is a difference between the drop delay timing of beads and cells? So if you're working with beads and cells of a similar size, how do you deal with, how do you deal with those differences?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a very interesting question, and yes, we did address that. We actually, so of course, any experiment, and especially any systematic approach, there's a lot of work. What we present at the end is just the tip of the iceberg, right, of all the things that were done. So we did address that issue where we were trying to see with, and actually have a poster on that. We had a poster in Saito a few years ago where we actually, with cells, we were showing that bigger cells, the impact on the laser time delay and the AccuDrop were relatively the same. We were trying to actually understand if the differences that we were seeing were only based on size. So clearly the cells were slowing, the bigger cells were slowing down with that rectangular cuvette compared to the square, and smaller cells were speeding up compared to the let's say 7-10 micron cells. And so it could be not only size, but it could be, for instance, density of the particle. So, we tried to do that comparison with cells and beads, and the result was pretty much the same. So at least in the conditions that we tested, we didn't see any differences. So it does indicate that at least size is a major contributor in that circumstance.
Great. Another question that's come through that we wanted to talk about is the many instruments that have been recently put out really stress their benchtop capabilities, right? And like the SRT, the Wolf. So with that, because they're so emphasizing the ease of use, how do we best incorporate training and making sure that the appropriate techniques are being followed, and what are some best practices that can be followed with these benchtop instruments?
I don't have an answer to that, but I could tell you what we on this side of the table need to stop doing is using the word "it's easy." It's not, right? Without the training, that you don't get it, you're just getting yourself in a mess. And typically what I see is molecular biology people getting instrumentation, and then you guys become the support.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. So education and training, obviously, but and I understand completely, not only from the perspective of a vendor, but also from the perspective of the researcher. Of course, you want things to be as simple as possible, right? You want the instruments to be, I would love to just press a button, have all the cells sorted, actually go automatically to sequencing or any other, downstream application. Without much effort and without having to control these things. But we're talking about a complex technique. And so, it's kind of maybe utopic to imagine that, at least currently, in the way that the technology is, at our disposal. But I do agree that it would be great to have things that were really simple to use, simple to operate. But I also acknowledge that that's extremely difficult. And so at least currently what we need to do, and if you think of the future of cell sorting, at least currently, there's still a lot of training that's involved in having people not only operate the instrument properly, but also, and for me, that's one of the most important things is assessing the performance of the experiment that you're doing, whether it's, sorting or anything else. But in this case, you need to understand if your sample prep is adequate for the sorter, and the sorter is well configured and well calibrated, and then at the end trying to understand if it actually performed well. Did it sort the right populations? So there's a lot, and it's extremely complex. Who said earlier something about this is still this is not an exact science. I think it was Chris was talking about, I forget now if it was, I think it was talking about unmixing, but I disagree a little bit there. It is exact science, but it's so complex that, only people that really can master things very well can really juggle all the variables. And so that's why it becomes a bit of an art rather than a science. And actually our mandatory class for training people for cell sorting is called The Art of Cell Sorting. So we do admit that it really takes a lot of training.
Really, I agree, but in the same sense, what you showed of the history of cell sorting and flow cytometry in general, we've come a very long way. Mm-hmm. And so, without showing my age, I've been doing this for a long time. And I realized that from when I started with a what they now call the legacy MetroFlow to what I'm using as the benchtop sorter, it's light years difference. And the average individual with a rather decent head on their shoulders can navigate the instrument pretty well. And I think what can be done to make this a lot easier is making sure that there's a lot of quality assurance on the manufacturer end, because machines that operate well are very easy to use. 90% of education comes to what happens when things go wrong. Because teaching someone the software is, you can do that. It's pretty straightforward. Everybody, I mean, these days, my teenagers probably could run circles around me just picking up any of these flow softwares and learn them in a heartbeat. I mean, I had my daughter, actually, my younger one, she's now 15, but when she was 6, she just watched the pattern of my finger and she would open my phone. And I said, how'd you do that? She goes, I just watched what you did. And I said, oh, okay, geez. So in these senses, it's very easy. I noticed most of the people, after we've given them just brief trainings and some support, they do very well. All the time it's come to me and say, you know, I have this problem, that problem, the other problem. And a lot of them, like you said, can be avoided simply by, you know, maintaining the instrument, making sure that people are doing proper cleanings. And so I find now my trainings have extended simply because I give the, you know, half hour of do not do this. You know, this has been done. We know it's bad. Don't do it. So I think it's good. I think the benchtops have come a long way to make things simplistic, make it, again, economically feasible for everyone to, you know, be sorting. Yeah, in a dream world, it would stain the samples, load them, put them in a plate, put them in the incubator, send them over to the, you know, the proteomics lab.
Right.
You know, and my job would just be to make sure that none of that fell apart. So,
who knows?
Yeah.
And actually these microfluidic cell sorters, right, like the Wolf or the Taito, or even like Cytonome was producing, those are going in that direction. And I was really excited to, maybe 2-3 years ago, I was giving a talk on cutting edge tools in cell sorting. Actually, the message was, it was actually the lack of cutting edge tools. But one of the examples I used to give was, you know, the advent of these microfluidic cell sorters, right, where you can start thinking of what's not sorted goes into, you know, go to a different compartment, what's sorted goes to another compartment, and you can actually start building a pipeline where, you know, you have all these liquid handlers and automatic, you know, robotic systems where it would just go through the, for instance, the sequencing pipeline, right? Is it a dream? Yeah, maybe, but maybe not that far, right? So I agree completely.
I'm going to swap it up a little bit. So, you know, talking about these conventional sorters and then the larger units, I was also trained on the legacy. As my first cell sorter. You know, I think more and more now the topic of biosafety comes up. So when we're talking about these benchtop units and we're talking about the, you know, the Arias, the Wolf, you know, many of these units, one of the nicest things about these chip-based sorters and the very low pressure is the reduced risk of aerosolization. So I'm curious, for the, you know, more traditional sorters, do you guys feel that AMS units or some type of enclosure should be a standard for all of these units coming out? What do you think the best way is to handle biosafety and cell sorting? Another small, tiny question.
I can start, because you got to think about these things. So for a while, it was thought that a lot of these self-enclosed units, you could start moving away, you know, depending on what you were doing. If it's just normal mouse work, maybe not so much. I think now you have to go back and think about that as, yes, everything should, or at least set up your flow facility in such a way that, you know, your sorting rooms are give a certain level of protection. You know, ours is all on a negative pressure, so everything is being sucked up through HEPA filters in the ceiling and whatnot. And, you know, and then there's another facility right above us that is actually, you know, in clean rooms. And there are, vaccine research center. So I think if nothing else, the pandemic has showed us that at any given time, things can go completely on their head, and you better have the tools ready to respond. I got a lot of asks for can we do COVID samples? Can we do COVID samples? Can we do COVID samples? And so, a lot of those things in my particular instance are directed up to a different facility, but at least we have that on hand, able to go. So I think biosafety is always going to be a top priority. If you think about it, in the actual design portion of your instrumentation, it becomes a lot easier than, no knock, Robert, we're old buddies, but saying, yeah, it'll just fit in a hood. Well, that's great. But if you think about how can I make this box in general very safety oriented, then this solves a lot of the issues.
Yeah, we were buddies.
Yeah, no, shout out to all the vendors, please, take these things into consideration. I love the concept of the Bigfoot with everything already integrated. It just makes so much sense in terms of validation, in terms of even standardization, right? Comparing, how to validate these kind of instruments. Once some people figure it out, you can apply it to all the similar instruments, right? In the same type of enclosures. And some of the vendors, and I can say, for instance, the opposite that I've seen is with the new Aurora cell sorter, where it seems that the biosafety containment was kind of an afterthought. And, it's a hood that wasn't made for that instrument. Then a lot of fixes were done. So I can't speak too much about the performance of the instrument, because we're having it literally installed at this moment. So I don't know. But in terms of biosafety, think about these things. We have our own hoods, rooms, and it's not only in New York, so around the world, rooms are very limited, right? And we have that space to put an instrument. And then things like, oh, by the way, to be able to service the instrument, you need to take it out of the hood. And in this case, for instance, with Cytec, the workaround was, here's a table that actually doesn't fold, and you have room for sure to have an extra table just hanging around, but don't put anything on top of it, because you're going to need it to service the instruments, right? So no, we don't have that, and I doubt that anyone in the world has that kind of space. Very few places. So these are very important practical considerations, right? The hood needs to work well. Validation is very important, certification of these hoods. And so having already these things enclosed in the appropriate, that has been tested by the actual vendor, I think is very important. If you buy a Baker hood, Baker just says, well, we just certify how much the airflow is going through, but whether it's protecting you or not from whatever you're putting in there, you have to validate it yourself. So it would be very useful to have vendors already on top of this. So yeah, very important.
Absolutely. So taking that into account, and like automated methods, you discussed RMAX before, and do you think that that's something that could be easily incorporated as an automated QC metric into a variety of sorters? Because there are multiple questions that came through that say, okay, so with these differing sizes, what do we do, right? Do we run different beads? What do we do? So I'm kind of addressing multiple questions that came through as far as what do you do in those cases.
Right.
So I'm curious if RMAX is something that could be incorporated.
Absolutely, that was one of the ideas that we discussed with a lot of vendors. I can say that I was really, happily surprised, when we first presented the RMAX method at Cyto. Sony, I think it was 2014, somewhere there, 2013 or 2014, and at the time Sony was introducing the Sony sorter. And I remember I forget his name, but a really sweet guy, engineer, very young guy, that came to me, and he was the engineer that was developing the Sony sorter, and he was asking, hey, I want to know much more about that because I want to use that to validate our method to determine the drop charge delay. And it was very interesting that, yeah, that's exactly what we wanted with this kind of method is to be able to validate. So if these things could be incorporated already, that would be great. But again, it is a simple method that one can use to be able to assess and validate that the drop charge delay. Speaking of different size particles, I mean, if you have that problem, if your instrument happens to have a problem with different cell sizes, then the answer cannot be, well, let's then measure the drop charge delay with a different size particle, because the samples are heterogeneous in terms of sizes, right? And you can actually have things like PBMCs where you can be sorting dendritic cells and macrophages and lymphocytes, which have very different sizes. So you would have to have on the fly, the instrument would have to decide, oh, this is this size. Oh, okay, based on the particle that you ran, I have to correct for that. So instead of correcting for all those things, at least so far, the only instruments that we've seen that have that problem were systems that were flawed, right? So were badly designed. And so, just design it properly and you won't have that issue. So I think the answer is more design it correctly. And actually, BD did correct that, right? They developed the square cuvette exactly because they knew they had problems with the rectangular cuvette. So they did solve that problem and it works perfectly well. So I think that's the answer, not necessarily workarounds. I just want to mention that we are, especially people, old people like John that have been in this field for quite a while, you know how it is, right? It's a lot of workarounds. We end up trying to fix the things that the companies or the vendors didn't think of in the first place. So instead of us working around and doing all these things, it would be great if the vendors would go back, look at their blueprints and actually fix those kind of things. That would be my answer.
You'd be surprised at the actual amount of protocols that have been written based on the workaround.
Exactly.
And so you're not giving the customer the actual vendor, what do they call them? Instructions per use, the
right.
IFUs. You're actually giving them the workaround to the IFU. So because there's little things and then you go, well, that's pretty stupid, but if I just do this in this order instead of the order they told me, everything's fine. And,
right.
I actually have a sheet tank on one of my instruments that there's a line on the cover and the actual tank because it can only be positioned that particular way or it doesn't pressurize correctly.
Right.
We tried several tanks and they all have the same problem. So, okay, there's the workaround. And I mean, it's better than trying to get 50 tanks a week.
Yeah, I can give a very simple example. For over 20 years, BD has had the ARIA out there, and every day you have to switch the connections from the PBS tank to the ethanol tank and the pressure, and the amount of times where our own users have messed up, or even us, right? You don't see it very properly, and then suddenly you make a mistake, and it's so easy to make these things almost mistake-free, and we actually developed a small set of switches here where instead of people having to disconnect things, they just switch air to ethanol and switch the liquid to ethanol, or go back to the PBS, and that's it. No mistake. The only mistake you can do, and that's why it's not 100%, but the only mistake you can do is if you forget, right? But if you do it, it's very hard that you make a mistake. So it's these kind of things that are very simple to think about, but unfortunately haven't really been implemented on a large scale.
Broader scale. Yeah, that was Mark Queens in the flow core there did that, and that was some wonderful work he did.
Yes.
So there's another question that we have from Mike Kistner, and he's saying that most available instruments utilize either electrostatic droplet deflection or microfluidics to really purify the droplets or particles, right? So what other types of potential technologies exist? Are you guys aware of any? Are there any other things that we should be on the lookout for?
I mean, maybe Robert has some insight inside, but it's funny because flow cytometry to me has always been variations of flow cytometry. It really has not, become novel in much sense. Yeah, microfluidics have entered the game. I mean, maybe, I think people have played around with syringe-based type stuff, and it's, there's problems with that also. So I think what you're ended up seeing, Mike, and I'm sure you also know some things, is things just keep getting smaller, right? So these bench tops are going to become just desktop, and the microfluidics is going to make that possible. And as Rui pointed out at the beginning of the discussion, speed's going to be always the thing, right? Because there's certain cell types that they don't like to go fast. They just don't, no matter what you do. They just hate it. And other cell types, you can crank your high-powered cell sorter up to 70,000, 80,000 events per second, and they're just like, that's fine. So I think it also depends on how well we can start getting the biology done. I think Rui points it out very well and always states it in every talk I've ever heard, is, and him and Alfonso Blanco, it starts with cell prep. The magic box cannot fix your sample. It also, as I've learned over my career, it does not multiply cells for you. So if you bring 1 million cells, don't expect to get 2 million positive back. I've had that too many times. So it'd be great. I don't know what the answer to that would be. I think someone posted, I forget where I was looking, and trying to figure out how you could get 96, 384 well plates to be sorted and deposited to another plate. So maybe that's the next one, right? I know there's certain things that do it on a level, but it'd be great on a high speed to be able to sample plate, send 2 different plates.
Yep.
It makes cell culture a lot easier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all I can say is that, actually most of the things that probably will come in the near future are typically under NDA anyway, so we can't really say. But I think one of the obvious is the full spectrum capabilities of sorters, right? That we've seen now with the Bigfoot from Propel, the Aurora CS, with the Fax Symphony S6. Let's see, I still haven't seen that, but we are hoping to see it very soon. But I think that would probably be the obvious and next step in sorting, having these capabilities. It's not so much the sorting process itself that's different, it's more the detection, but it's still pretty impressive if you can start sorting based on 40 parameters or more. It could be interesting to see these subsets and look at them functionally, and see how they behave in different scenarios. So that for me would be probably the obvious. In terms of technological improvements of sorters, not that I know of.
Well, I have a question. I'll get back to Mike. Mike, how far away are you from making the Bigfoot be benchtop?
Oh, well, yeah. Interesting question. I think Mike's not here to be able to to kind of provide that feedback, but it's a good question. I want to kind of wrap it up. We have about 2 more minutes left, so I'm going to ask one question that came from Ira that I think is pretty interesting, especially for sorters that are in a flow core. So some automated cell sorters have the option to choose between standard and fragile cells when you're doing the setup. So do you think that it would be helpful in the future, or would it be possible for cell sorters to ask more nuanced questions such as fragility of the cells, and ask experimental specific questions that could really hone in on how the sorter is set up and kind of guide the user to the best outcome? Does that seem like kind of, yeah?
Yeah, it would just be wizard based, right? You just have a wizard, and I would think the only things you could actually really affect would be suggestions, right? Because manually you have to change tips, nozzle sizes. I guess it could be pressure changes, because even on certain ones, I mean, there's recommended you got a 70 micron tip, use 60 PSI. Okay. But we find that certain things, if you drop it down to 50, you can still get great breakoffs and your streams get a little tighter to the sides and all this other fun stuff. But I think it's limited in what it actually, because it says you can pick fragile or whatever, but I mean, you kind of do that anyways. You know, you're not going to take a fragile cell and just run it at, 30, 40,000 events per second.
Yeah.
You're also
if you have that knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
But even if you have that knowledge, I think the biggest problem here is how do you define fragility, right? And this is the problem that we've addressed when we were trying to, do these systematic studies to evaluate the impact of sorters on cells. Is okay. What are the readouts, right? How do you evaluate? Is it viability? But cells can be alive, but then functionally they can be knocked out. And actually, one of the examples I usually give, we tried for a few years, unfortunately we weren't successful, but with platelets, where it's just impossible to put platelets through a high-speed cell sorter and at the end have them behave functionally, right? They're completely activated, and sometimes they don't even respond because they're already activated. So it's difficult to do any functional studies after that. So that's why I stress a lot sample preparation. Of course, there are some cells that are very difficult, but sample preparation is key. And if you think of when you dissociate a tissue and you're looking at cells basically when in the solid tissue, they survive due to all the signaling that goes with the neighboring cells, right? The moment you remove them, it's a race. They're going to commit suicide, right? So there's a race to keep them alive, and that's why we keep them on ice and things like that, to be able to maintain them alive, run them through the sorter. And actually, that's why I keep saying the sorter is the least of the worries of a cell. Yeah, it's a lot of pressure. But cells are used to a lot of pressure anyway, but they don't have those physiological signals to keep alive. So that I think is the main issue, especially if you want to do any downstream application, which we obviously do after sorting.
Great. I think that wraps up our roundtable on cell sorting. There are still 1 or 2 questions left in the Q&A, so maybe we can type out some answers there. But in the meantime, Rui, John, Robert, I just want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and the talks, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Happy to see everyone.
Yes.
Yes, thank you all. I'd like to give a round of applause for all of the attendees. And thank you to Thomas and Kathy for hosting. Thank you to all of our speakers from today and yesterday. I thank everyone for attending from wherever you are. And I look forward to seeing everyone in person, hopefully at CITO 2022. And hopefully we'll be able to plan an in-person MetroFlow in the fall of 2022. That will be our goal if World Health cooperates. So stay safe, everyone, be well, and thank you for your time.